All right, so sorry for the quick hiatus. I mean, it was a couple crazy weeks, so, you know, life. Anyway, last time we looked at how to fix the charging handle and all that stuff. We found a nice little hack to do that, so that was great. But now I can actually start in on the things that I really wanted to focus on, which is like the main components of the gun. The first one that we're going to be upgrading and changing out is the cylinder head, as well as the piston and piston head. So 4 pieces, technically 5 if you count a sorbo pad, and I'll show you what that means. But first I just kind of wanted to go over cylinders and the cylinder heads and all that stuff, just to kind of give you a high level of what's going on here. So this is the stock one that came with the classic Army gun, and it is actually really nice. So I'm not going to hate on this at all. There's nothing wrong with it. There was a little seal problem, but that just was because there was grime in there and I cleaned it out, and now it's like pretty solid. So if you look, put the piston in and you cover the tip and you push, and that's solid. Like, that's not going anywhere. So that's a really good seal in here. Part of the reason for that is this is a really nice cylinder head. It's not flashy, but it works really well, and the O-ring is in great shape. So despite its age, this O-ring is solid. It's still got all its flexibility. It's not brittle. They greased it well when it came off the factory floor. Apparently, it looks like somebody may have even greased it afterwards, which is perfect. So nothing wrong here. All the teeth are in good shape. You can see there, no stripping. Part of that is because they did a really good job shimming this gearbox, as well as making sure that I think they used a really nice polymer for this. So this is a plastic teeth, but it's really hard plastic. Looks to be in good shape. A little scoring on the back ones where the gear engagement, nothing crazy. And also cylinder head and the cylinder. So if you take this apart, actually 2 parts, right? Cylinder head and cylinder. This is a ported cylinder. You can tell because it's got a port in it, which means that you're not actually getting the full cylinder of volume. You're just getting from here forward air volume as the piston's engaging. It helps with 2 things. One, it gives you more room for air to get in and fill the cylinder, so the piston actually moves a lot quicker past that point because it's not compressing. So it doesn't start compressing until it gets past that. And then the cylinder head has that O-ring. It's in good shape. And it looks like it has just like a thin sorbothane or rubber pad there. So angle of engagement probably wasn't good. I think, remember correctly, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't the worst. Like, it's going to work. But yeah, so this is in good shape. This is a ported cylinder. I wanted to take this from a ported cylinder because this was all putting out about, I think, about 300 FPS, 310 maybe. I want to take this up to 400. That's mostly the limit for these kinds of AEGs on the field. So right about that 400 range. So with that, as well as the fact that we have a very long barrel, so this is the barrel we're going to be putting in. This is 510 millimeters. The previous one was about 300 millimeters. So this brings up one of the most mathematical pieces of airsoft guns, and one of the things that we have to pay the most attention to, which is tuning our cylinders to our barrels. So because we have a long barrel, right, and that means a lot of air volume is needed to get a BB through it, like it's a lot of air volume there, we need to have more than that in air volume behind it. So this wasn't going to cut it. A ported cylinder where you immediately take off about 1/3 of this cylinder, almost half if you count how far into the cylinder the head goes here. Like, you only have that much air volume, and that's not going to cut it. There's more than that in air volume in the barrel, which means that the BB would actually begin to have negative pressure applied to it about here, probably about 1/3 of the way down. So it would have to travel this much farther with negative air pressure, which isn't going to work. What I mean by negative air pressure is, if you think of 2 syringes stuck end to end, right? So think of these as syringes, and you stick them end to end. And we might actually be able to do this, but probably not. We'll see. Let me try this. This might be fun. As I push this in here, this one would have come out, right, if these were two syringes. So if you think of two syringes here, end to end, the syringe that has the most air volume would push the plunger out of the other syringe because it has more air pressure. Think of it the same way with a barrel. If you are going to have more air volume in your cylinder than you do in your barrel, then the BB traveling through it when that cylinder compresses is going to be able to push that BB all the way out and have some pressure left over after the BB exits. If it doesn't, if the cylinder has less air volume than the barrel, as you press that cylinder and you compress the piston into the cylinder, the BB is going to travel really fast until the cylinder head reaches the end of the cylinder. And if there's not enough air volume to get it out, the BB is going to sit there with more pressure outside, so ahead of the barrel, than there is behind it. So it creates a vacuum. And this is what you'll see a lot of times when people don't tune this, when they use a stock cylinder and piston with a really long barrel. The BB actually loses momentum inside the barrel and falls out the end or rolls out the end because it's being carried by a little bit of kinetic energy, and some air was able to escape into the barrel behind the BB to let it continue its path, but slowly. So you'd actually lose a lot of FPS, and you would actually ruin essentially the physics of your gun if you don't have more pressure behind it than in front of it. So a couple options we have there. One, we would go with an unported cylinder. An unported cylinder would theoretically give you enough pressure, just enough to get the BB out with some left over, which is great. That's one option. But if you really want to make sure that a long barrel like this, especially as you get over 450 millimeters, I would go with a bore-up kit. Now, bore-up kit, what does that do? This is a normal unported cylinder. You can see in there. Nothing fancy, it's just a solid piece of metal cylinder. A bore-up kit takes that a step further and actually thins out the inner wall of the cylinder so that you get more volume inside of it. So I ran the numbers and you actually get about 10 to 15% more air volume out of a bore-up cylinder than you do a normal cylinder, just because of how much more room there is inside without that inner wall. So this, much thicker wall, this one very thin. Like, it's noticeable how thin it is. In fact, you get more than 1 millimeter of inner diameter. If you want to measure this stuff yourself, I highly recommend getting calipers. So millimeter calipers, and they look like this, right? So you can measure the inside diameter or something using these. So you put this on here, and you measure like that, and you can measure what the inner diameter is on that display there. I love that. I'm a big fan. So that's what I did, and I measured and I made sure that we had a ratio of at least, if I remember correctly, it was at least 1.7 to 1. That's the ratio that we had. So for this being 1, we had 1.7 times the amount of air volume able to be held in this bore-up kit, which is perfect. So that gives us more air volume behind the BB than we would have normally had, which is going to up our FPS. Some people are a little scared. They say, oh, it's going to rattle around inside the barrel. Not if you have a tight bore like this. So this is a 6.01 inner diameter millimeter barrel. So that means that it's extremely tight tolerance. That's what we call it, tolerance on the BB. You'll see things that are like Orga barrels or Miracle barrels, and they actually have more inner diameter than a normal barrel. They're at 6.08 millimeters. And that means that the BB is going to have more air around it as it's traveling out. Some schools of thought say that's better because it has a bigger cushion. I don't. I think that allows for more movement of that BB along the inside of the barrel. 6.01, it's going to hug the inside of that barrel either on the lower or upper side of it, and it will cleanly follow that groove all the way out. There's no room for it to bounce, really. There is only one barrel tighter than this. This is a 6.01 from Angel Customs. There is a 6.00, so there is one that is exactly matched to the diameter of the BB. I don't like that. I think that gives you a little bit too much friction, because you would literally be riding the walls of that barrel with a 6mm BB. So 6.01, people have tested it and it works better than a 6.03. and then most guns actually come with a 6.05 inner millimeter barrel. So that means that they're not as tight as they could be, but they're more forgiving. The biggest thing to remember with barrels like this that are tight bore is it's not necessarily the tight bore, it's how perfect the manufacturing was. So don't get one of these barrels from like AliExpress or whatever expecting a really nice barrel. I would always go with a name brand one. It's just going to be a better bet. And get steel if you can. Brass is fine, it's just a softer metal. So steel is better. So that's what I got. It's a steel Angel SUS 304 Ultra Precision Inner Barrel, 6.01 millimeters, 510 millimeter length. Okay, so there's that. So we have this. This comes out to, I think I did the math, and it was 22,356 millimeters cubed. That's the air volume of this, and the barrel was, I forget, it's like 15,000, 16,000 maybe. So we're coming out a lot more on this. Now, sorbothane, real quick, I just want to touch on this. There's a bunch of videos on it, so I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but sorbothane is a small pad that sits on the back of the cylinder head. So when we'll use this one for example, when the piston comes in to meet it, it actually stops right there because you have sorbothane pads here. The reason that's important is for angle of engagement. So angle of engagement is where the gears come to meet the pistons. So I'll try to show you here with the gears we got. Here we go. We'll put our gear in here so we can demonstrate this. All right. So if you look at this, this is where the gear meets the cylinder, right? Or the piston, sorry. You can see it engage right there and start pulling the piston back. Well, that angle is what we call the angle of engagement. So where that tooth is meeting the piston, that's the angle of engagement. And this is not a great angle of engagement, as you can see. It's a little bit too forward. It's not going to give you the most snappy response, and that's not the most powerful position for that gear to engage. So sorbothane, when you put a pad on that cylinder head, it actually lets this piston rest right here, so a little bit farther back. That means when the gear comes back to meet it, it's actually engaging. Let's do this right here. It's actually engaging more right there. So when this comes back, it's actually in a much more powerful position as it starts its rotation. Now, one thing we had to remember, and one reason I went with the bore-up kit, is that limits the amount of air volume you're allowed to compress, because guess what? Instead of having the entirety of this piston, or sorry, this cylinder for air volume, you have to drop this back a little bit, so now you've lost about that much. All right, so right where my finger is, it's about how much you've lost. So you now only have this much air volume. And therefore, bore-up kit, giving you that extra little surplus of air volume, lets you do those kinds of things and have less impact to the power of the BB coming out. So we did that. Now you'll notice when this is spinning, if it's resting right here, that first tooth actually wants to engage the third tooth on this piston. So you actually have to cut out a couple of these teeth to make it so that when this thing turns around, it's engaging just this last tooth with the piston. So what we can do is either shave off a couple of those teeth ourselves, or you just buy a piston that already has that done. Most of them come with that tooth shaved off already. So for example, our bore-up kit and the piston head that I got, this is a Garter bore-up kit by the way, they came pretty highly recommended. When we put our piston in here, you see that my you see that my piston's sitting right there. Now it'll be a little bit more compressed because of the spring tension that's going to be on here. So let's push that down. When this gear now comes around, it misses that tooth because they cut it out and just engages the back of the piston, and we're good to go. Right, so it worked out pretty well. But just know that if you have a piston that you want to keep using, you totally can. You just got to shave off the second and third tooth potentially to let your gear engage at the correct angle without stripping. Otherwise, it's just going to short stroke your piston, and that doesn't really do anybody any good. Okay, that's all I had for this one. Nothing to it. I just wanted to explain why we would go with a bore-up kit and why I think it's a good idea, especially for longer barrels and when you're using sorbo pads to correct for angle of engagement. It just gives you more air volume to work with. All right, with that, I'll let you go. Super simple.